Well, hello once again. How's it going? Welcome to another Crime Dive. My name is Crystal Sky, and if you're anything like me, you find yourself drawn to true crime cases. So I decided to make videos about it. If you also like true crime and want to feel better about your makeup skills, you should absolutely like, subscribe, and let's hang out together every Tuesday where I will take a deep dive look into a true crime case while slapping on the old clown paint. So how are we doing? You ready to continue our look into the Scott Moody case? So sorry that part 1 was a week delayed in being uploaded. Yeah, Jeff and I got a doggo. Yeah, we got a little Siberian husky that we rescued from a shelter, and I've just wanted to do nothing but spend time with the dog. We had to, take her to the vet because she had a little bit of a kennel cough, so, we've been giving her some meds. Had to get her groomed, had to go buy a bunch of toys and stuff. And yeah, I'm just gonna keep it real with y'all. I just didn't feel like editing or doing anything. I just wanted to spend time with, my new doggo. So yeah, so sorry about that. But come on, look at that face. Isn't she precious? I love her so much. I need the Brooklyn Nine-Nine meme with Diaz, where she has the dog, and it's like, oh, I've only had so-and-so for like a week, but if anything ever happened to it, I'd kill everyone and then myself. That's what I need. I need that meme with me poorly photoshopped and then like a little pupper's name, which we named her Vex, by the way. She's about a year old, Siberian Husky, and we named her Vex after Vexalia. So yeah, she's so precious. I love her so much. And yeah, that is why I was delayed by a week. So sorry. But let's switch gears now and let's continue our look at the Moody Massacre, all right? This was a case suggested to me by one of y'all. Thank you so much. I love when you guys put case suggestions down there. So thank you so much to Smash the Bug for pointing me in the direction of this case. Quick recap of part 1. We went through everyone that this case involves, right? We went through Scott, Stacy, their mother Kay, and their biological father, their divorce, and, Kay's family sort of drama to do with inheritance and land, and we went over all of that. We went into the details of the awful, brutal massacre that happened. And if you will remember, so we ended with, the cops, they're roaming the scene. They already, assumed that Scott was the shooter because of how he was found. If you remember, we already have a little discrepancy with how Scott was found with the murder weapon, if you'll remember that. And then we ended with the interviews starting, all right? So let's see, who did we go over? We went through Jason Southerly and, his recap of the events. And then we ended part 1 with the police interviewing Scott's former stepfather, Stephen Wolfe, who, like many others, did not believe Scott had done this. If you'll remember, the last thing that Stephen Wolfe discussed with investigators before his interview ended was he wanted to know where the murder weapon had come from. So the Schaefer family had guns and Scott had gone hunting before, but Stephen here did not know where this murder weapon came from. It was a .22 rifle, and he wanted to know where that came from because he personally, on all the years he was married to Kay and lived there, he never saw that gun in his own home or in Kay's parents' home. So that's where we ended. So we'll pick up part 2 with more of the police interviews being conducted. We'll open with Scott and Stacy's biological father and their stepmother, Steve and Audrey, and kind of what they discuss with police. And we will go from there. Just quick forewarning, this whole case, we're discussing very, very adult themes. Part 1, we went through pretty graphic details with the crime scene. Today, we'll be talking a little bit more into details. Some people might be a little too gruesome for some people. Others will be fine. Yeah, just forewarning. There's a lot of heavy themes in this case. And next week, we will be talking, about child sex abuse, unfortunately. So be prepared for that. Just be prepared. This whole case, there's a lot of heavy stuff in it. Okay, so after all of that, let's go ahead and continue our look into the Scott Moody case. So after police interviewed Stephen Wolfe, Kay's second husband, they then went to the hospital and talked with Steve and Audrey because they were, of course, monitoring Stacy at all times. If you remember, she was helicoptered to a hospital in Columbia, which was like 45 minutes away. She was in serious critical condition. Did I say Columbia? meant Columbus. Jesus, I don't know what is going on. I am like just feeling all kinds of loopy today. My allergies are kicking my ass. So sorry. Columbus is where Stacy was in the hospital, Columbus, Ohio. So police went to, interview Steve and Audrey and just kind of, get their take on everything that happened. If you remember, they were really trying to get people's perception of what they thought about Scott, because they, were already assuming that, like, Scott was the shooter and he, did this terrible massacre. So Steve and Audrey ended up kind of recounting to the police the little bit of dramas that still existed regarding custody between Kay and Steve. Steve talked about how just the weekend before the massacre, he had gone to Kay's residence to pick up Stacy for his, visitation that he had. Remember, Steve had every other weekend visitation, and then it was like every Wednesday, every Wednesday or Thursday, he had once a week visitation as well. And Kay would always make it so, he never got that visitation, right? He told police, I would come up to the house, nobody would answer the door, nobody answered their phones, so all we could do was knock and leave voicemails. There wasn't really anything else. And if you remember, it was just Stacy that Steve was seeing at this point, because Scott had decided not to see his father anymore when he was about 16. So Steve said, the weekend before the massacre, they had gone to Kay's home to try to pick Stacy up for their visitation. Surprise, surprise, nobody answered the door. They then went the following Wednesday for, again, their visitation. But shocker, once again, nobody answered the door. Audrey told police that this was not the first time that this had happened. As we well know, she told them, quote, "We tried several times, but we never received an answer." And that was in regards to trying to get a hold of Kay or Stacy or anyone, but nobody answered their phone calls or their knocks at the door, And honestly, at that point, right, like Stacy's, a teen at this point, there's not really a whole lot Steve, can do. He can go to court and get Kay in trouble, but, as we well know, right, that's a process that takes a long time. You got to get the kids involved, and I know, a lot of parents are trying to avoid that. So it's just a shame that Kay, even after all these years of being divorced, was still undermining Steve's visitation, At least that's what it seemed like. I never came across anything that said Stacy wanted to stop seeing her father the same way that Scott did. I never came across any of that. Audrey continued telling the police about the family dynamics. Quote, "Stacy's been under a lot of stress lately. Apparently, there has been a lot of yelling and fighting at Sherry Kay's home. There's been a lot of drinking and parties lately. Her mom was out of control." Steve added to this by saying, quote, "Stacy told us at different times that Dave, remember Dave Cusick, Sherry Kay's then boyfriend, brought marijuana into the house." Steve reiterated the sort of torn relationship that he had with his son and how Scott had decided to stop seeing him, stop exercising his visitation with his father. Steve told police that he actually hadn't spoken to his son, since he decided to stop coming over. It had been about 2 to 3 years at that point. And remember, if you'll remember, Stephen Wolf, Scott's stepfather, Kay's second husband, he didn't know why Scott decided to stop seeing his father. But if you'll also remember, we went over how, Kay tried to undermine Steve's relationship with their children, always talking smack and stuff. So there are some who wonder if, it just came to a point where kind of Scott believed everything and didn't want anything to do with him. No one seems to have a clear answer of why Scott decided to stop seeing his father. The Moodys continued informing the police a little bit about what they knew about what life was like living at Kay's home. Audrey said that she did know of drugs in the home. I'm guessing that's the marijuana we mentioned. And she said that Stacy had told her that Scott had actually been pretty angry with his mother over the last couple of years. I guess, according to Audrey, she said Stacy told her that Scott would often cuss at his mother, use her first name, not call her mom. And it just seemed that, Scott was having a little bit of some issues with his mother. The police then asked the Moodys about, any weapons that they knew of the home, again, trying to identify where the murder weapon had come from. Steve said he knew of no specific weapons that were in Kay's home, and he just knew that the family, quote, were a bunch of hunters. That's all he knew. And that's really all they kind of interviewed the Moodys for at this time. I mean, kind of makes sense, right? They're kind of busy dealing with Stacy right now. They didn't live at Kay's home, so all they can really do is maybe fill in some gaps on on family history and stuff like that, right? The next person interviewed was Andrew Denny. If you remember, we mentioned him. He was a party goer as well. Stacy had invited him. So he was the next one that police talked to, and he was interviewed that Sunday afternoon. So Andrew was a 19-year-old local boy, and he said that Stacy had called him around midnight that Saturday night / Sunday morning, inviting him over to the party that was happening. So Andrew decided to take Stacy up on her invitation, and he drove the 20 miles from his home, which was in Xenia, Ohio, and he arrived at Stacy's home at approximately 1 a.m. that Sunday morning. Now, Andrew said when he got to the home, as we know, the party was still in full motion. It wouldn't end till around 3-ish, 4-ish, and he didn't know anyone at the party except for Stacy. Andrew told police that to him, it seemed like everyone was pretty intoxicated. Like, it definitely seemed like, it was obvious they had been drinking. He said the only two people that didn't seem super wasted or drunk was Kay and Jason. He said everyone seemed to be having a good time. There was no, talk of, drugs or guns. None of that came out. There was no hostilities. It was just a chill, kind of laid back party. When he got there, Megan was already passed out on the love seat, and he was told that she had passed out around midnight. He said, quote, "We hung out for a while and drank a couple of beers, and then me and Stacy went upstairs to her bedroom and made out." He said he had to get up for work really early the next morning. So before him and Stacy kind of dozed off / cuddled in the bed, she set her alarm for 6 a.m. But when it went off, Andrew said, quote, "Stacy hit the snooze button several times, and he finally woke up and started getting out of the house more around 7. Now, he said when he left the home, all the bedroom doors were closed. He remembered seeing Megan asleep on the love seat and a guy asleep on the couch. He said nobody seemed awake or alert, and he just quickly rushed out of the house because, he had to go to work. He approximated he left around 7:15 a.m. that morning or so. He didn't have an exact time. He just knew a rough estimate. So meanwhile, as police are continuing their interviews, trying to get more information on the party and the background of everyone involved, the graduation ceremony for Megan and Scott's class continued on. 2 seats remained vacant in the graduating class. I guess news of the massacre had actually reached school officials 10 minutes before the ceremony was to begin. So, it went on as it was scheduled, but they did hold a moment of silence in Scott and Megan's memory. The school had also asked Sheriff Henry to postpone his press conference until after the graduation ceremony. But remember, this is a pretty small community, even if it's dispersed across several rural, little communities and towns. Everyone still kind of knows everyone, and so there were a few people who showed up to the graduation ceremony already knowing what had happened and already knowing that the police were pointing the finger at Scott. Now, when Brett was told of what happened, he, of course, was super shook. I mean, it gives me goosebumps just talking about it. How would you feel if you were Brett, guys? If you had, woken up super early and jetted, got out because you had stuff to do or whatever, and you learned that mere hours after you had left, everyone in the house that you were sleeping next to and had partied with mere hours before was dead. Wouldn't that shake you? So yeah, he was, of course, very shooken up when he was told of the news. He would say, quote, "It's a good thing I didn't get lazy. If I would have been there, I would have probably been shot too." So remember, later that same day, his family had planned to go to a baseball game, a Cincinnati Reds game, and that was one of the reasons he had woken up so early. He had to get his farm chores done. They had to get everything done so that they could then go to a baseball game. And it was during the 4th inning of the game that Brett got a phone call on his cell phone, and he was informed of what had happened. Yeah, talk about a mood killer. I wouldn't be able to enjoy the rest of the game if I were him. He just said of the awful news, quote, "I couldn't believe it." I mean, yeah, who would, man? I mean, what an awful phone call to get. One of Paige's family members spoke out and they said, quote, "That was one of our family. It's just a bad thing. Stuff like that's not supposed to happen." And though the sheriff's office, had acquiesced to the high school's request and not had their press conference yet, it was already spreading like wildfire, what had happened, and that the entire Schaefer family was now dead. People were already talking that Scott had killed them all and then killed himself. And, one of the reasons that, all of this story spread like wildfire even before the press conference, not only is it a small, tight-knit community, the press got wind of this, of what had happened, and they swarmed on the town that day. And of course, it's a small town. You've got like media there, putting like their cameras and microphones in people's faces. So all the locals had something to say. Everyone knew the Schaefers at some point, right? So everyone wanted to kind of give their 2 cents on what they thought of everything that had happened. Fellow student Brandon Stewart, who went to school with all of them, like Scott, Stacy, Brett, Megan, Paige, like he went to school with all of them. And he said, yeah, everyone got along with, all the kids involved, Scott included. They weren't, troublemakers. They weren't bullies or anything. They were just, average run-of-the-mill students. He said, quote, none of them seemed like troublemakers. Delia Comer, remember, she was Megan's friend, described Scott as, quote, real sweet, easy to get along with, and, quote, real quiet. He wasn't a troublemaker or anything. Teachers liked him. Brett straight up came out and told the press that he didn't think that his friend had done this. He straight up said it. He's like, no, I don't believe Scott did this. I don't believe he actually pulled the trigger, He was not shy in that was his belief. And that seemed to actually be a common belief throughout the entire area. No one believed that Scott Moody had actually massacred his family and friends, including his girlfriend, and then himself. Like, nobody believed it. According to another student, Alan Coy, he told the press, quote, no one believes he did it. A local resident of DeGraff, Mike Pierce, told the press, quote, I just can't picture it. He was a good kid, quiet. Everybody wants to know why. So yeah, immediately, all right, guys, this is like even before the press conferences happened, people are like, nah, there's no way Scott did this. Like, I was really like shocked and floored when I was reading some of the local articles that had, little blurbs from the local residents and what they thought of everything. And yeah, the common belief was like, nah, there's got to be something else going on here. There's no way this kid did this. This makes no sense. And if you remember, I mentioned this in the last video, Columbine hadn't really happened all that long ago. Mass shootings in general were just sort of like a really like fascinating news topic and stuff. And so that was one of the things people were talking about. I was like, wait, like we talk about all these warning signs and what to look out for. But what do you do when you have a kid like Scott who didn't exhibit any of these behaviors? I think that was really what was like screwing with people and like was a total mindfuck for a lot of people, is that they just were like, but this kid didn't exhibit any of this. He was a mild-mannered kid. Maybe there was like some family drama here or there, but like, everyone was like, this doesn't make any sense, make it make sense. So I just thought that was super interesting. Like from the get-go, there was pushback against this idea that Scott had done this. So that's, spreading through the town and, police are getting ready for the press conference. And a local Reverend Jones, was going to get ready to help counsel those who were going to come in that Sunday and kind of need it, again, tight community and stuff. So, you know your neighbors, everyone else. And so Reverend Jones was sort of, preparing like how he was going to counsel people, because like, everyone knew everyone. There was a lot of people that knew Kay and Scott, Stacy, Gary, and Cheryl, Paige, Megan, like, everyone knew. So like this affected a lot of people. So he was, in his home kind of preparing how to counsel everyone. And he had his police scanner on. Now, is this a common thing in rural communities to have like police scanners? Like, is that like a form of communication? Like so many instances in this case have people listening to their police scanner. I think that was another thing that helped the story spread to all the locals. So yeah, I thought that was like super interesting because I was always told that police scanners were illegal. I don't know. I just thought that was super interesting. Anyway, getting back to it. So Reverend Jones is listening to his police scanner while he's thinking how he's going to counsel the local residents. And he overheard on his police scanner that Sheriff Henry had already closed this case. This is the Sunday afternoon, guys. The Sunday of the attack. And Reverend Jones would later say that he thought to himself when he heard that, quote, declared closed already, only a few hours after the shootings. He thought it was remarkable. Like, wait, what? These shootings literally happened hours ago, and Sheriff Henry is already putting the word out that the case is officially closed? So the police held their press conference just mere hours after the massacre. They announced, of course, what happened. Logan County Sheriff Lieutenant Chuck Stout said, quote, I've been doing this for 35 years and I've never seen anything like this. This had been the first homicide in Logan County since 2004. And Sheriff Henry said, quote, this is going to stun the community, as we have already begun discussing, right? The police announced that they found several guns in the homes, Kay and Gary and Cheryl's, including the rifle that they said Scott had used to butcher everyone and then himself. They said the weapons had been sent for ballistic tests ballistics testing at the Ohio Bureau of Identification and Investigation. While the bodies had been sent to the Montgomery County Coroner's Office to be autopsied, they told the press that they estimated the deaths to have happened anywhere between 7 a.m. and 10 a.m. They believed that Scott had probably crossed the crop fields in order to get to his grandparents' home and then crossed back over after he had killed them. They theorized that he then reloaded his rifle once he got home and then proceeded to murder everyone in the house. They theorized that Megan was the first to be killed, after Gary and Cheryl, obviously. Then they estimated it was Kay, Paige, Stacy, before Scott turned the gun on himself. Authorities told the press that they had responded to calls at Kay's home several times, but it was for petty nuisance stuff, like too loud of music, kids being too loud or something, like nothing violent, nothing major, nothing with felonies or anything like that, They also announced at this time that they believed everyone in the homes had been shot while they were asleep, with the exception of Gary and Cheryl. They said, quote, "There was no sign of a struggle at either of the two houses, and it appeared that all of the deceased victims at Sherry K. Schaefer's house were killed while they slept." Now, police released few other details at first, citing that they were still, investigating the scene and all that. But they did say publicly that though they were still gathering evidence and processing the scene, everything pointed to Scott being the shooter. Quote, "The suspect is one of the deceased. You can just imagine what it's like to deal with something like this as a parent. Nobody deals with something like this." And this is what Sheriff Henry told the press. Now, the Moodys, Steve and Audrey, then released a public statement as they were still, by Stacy's side in the hospital. We'll get into it. Yeah, she was in critical condition, guys. If you remember, we went over her wounds in the last video, and it's pretty amazing that she survived, honestly. But the Moodys said in their statement, quote, "The family of Stacy Moody wants to thank everyone for their prayers and concerns. At this time, we are staying with Stacy. She is resting comfortably and breathing on her own. We do ask for prayers for the families of all the victims. We also would like for everyone in the country to pray for all the young people." And, unsurprisingly, Steve and Audrey would be interviewed multiple times by police. Again, just kind of repeating themselves a little bit, kind of repeating the family dynamics, the battle that was going on over Wilma's inheritance, like her will and stuff, going over how, there was still a lot of bitterness between Kay and Steve and, getting his visitation and all that. Now, Audrey said that around the time that Scott said that he wasn't going to come over anymore, Stacy had told her that Kay had gotten involved with a man who was selling and dealing drugs out of Kay's house. And I don't know if we're to assume that was the Dave Cusick guy. Audrey added that she heard rumors around town, never substantiated by herself or her own eyes, but she heard rumors around town around this time that Kay had lost a lot of weight, suspiciously, like a suspiciously large amount of weight in a short period of time, and that she kind of appeared to be sort of like haggard and tired looking. So I don't know if the insinuation there is that it was supposed to be meth or something more hardcore. I don't know. And again, remember, these are just rumors that Audrey heard around town. Audrey said, quote, "This was a 24/7 party house. The kids knew that as long as Mom was having disputes with her parents, Cheryl and Gary Schaefer, they could do whatever they wanted. Sherry Kay knew it was important to keep them happy. She hated the idea that they might live with their father." Audrey also brought up a strange incident that actually involved her daughter, Nikki, and it happened just a few months prior to the massacre. So Kay had visited Nikki, and she asked Nikki if it would be possible if Kay wanted Nikki to take out a loan so that Stacy could get her own car because she was going to be learning to drive soon, and Kay wanted Stacy to have her own vehicle. And she went to her ex-husband's new wife's daughter to ask. Isn't that bizarre? It's so weird. Now, Nikki told Kay, no. She's like, I don't have good credit, and, quote, "I don't see that happening." Yeah, she was like, no, of course not. No, I don't even have good credit. Of course I'm not gonna take out a loan so, you can buy your daughter a car. Audrey told police that she was kind of upset when her daughter told her this. She was like, wait a minute, who is this broad to be coming to my daughter and asking such like an intimate request, like taking out a loan so you can buy your daughter a car? Like, what the hell? She also didn't understand it because she had also heard around this time that Kay had been approved for that grant and another loan to help with the farm repairs. Remember, we talked about how the farm was due for a comeback? So this was like doubly upsetting to Audrey. She's like, wait a minute, I just heard about like this grant and this loan that she was getting and that things were looking up. Why the hell is she coming to my daughter for this request? Like, this is weird. And Audrey just told police she had no idea like why Kay needed extra money, if it really was for a car for Stacy, or why she had gone to Nikki for it. She had no idea. So after the police had, had their press conference, announced the victims, how they believed, Scott, and, dispersed or whatever, many questions, of course, were asked around town as like, okay, if they're saying Scott did this, like, why would he do this? What would cause him to do this? And everything, because this was like a case that from the articles I could see, it was discussed like nationwide, again, primarily due to what I was talking about, how Scott didn't exhibit any of the, telltale signs, as it were, of, especially young kids who, do these kinds of mass shootings. And it really had people scratching their heads, and everything, guys, from violent video games to the impending responsibilities of graduation and taking over the family farm to an argument that Scott had with Gary. Like, they were looking, like, I saw so many articles that were like, oh, it was obviously violent video games. Oh, it was obviously Scott snapped because of the responsibilities thrust on him. Oh, he had an argument with his grandfather like a few months prior. It could have been that. Like, everyone was grasping at straws. It was pretty wild to see all these like articles talking about it and speculating, and all these like professionals and people in power and authority just kind of like speaking with absolute certainty that like they knew that this is obviously what caused it. And it's like, okay, I don't know where's your proof or your evidence? Bernie, remember, she was the superintendent of schools where Scott went to school. She said, quote, how in the heck would you say he's going to be a problem? How do you protect against a kid who never came across our radar screen? Again, talking about, what we were just talking about is that like people are all like, he was such a mild-mannered, good, sweet kid. Like, how are you supposed to prevent something like this? And I think that's really what creeped people out, That's always what creeps people out, is like the unexplained crimes where you can't really point to a motive or a rhyme or reason, or, you can't even do hindsight and point to something that, oh, well, that was the sign back there. We should have taken that seriously. None of that was in this case. Like, there was nothing like that in Scott's past that people could point to and be like, oh, that was the telltale sign. We should have, looked harder at that. A friend of Scott's named Kevin Williams said, quote, I had not heard of any family problems. We talked all the time. We had classes together and everything. The real disappointment is he had to choose this route. A neighbor named Mabel Watts told the press, quote, I just don't understand. The young boy, I just can't picture him doing this. Stephen, Scott's stepfather, remember, Steve Moody is Scott and Stacy's biological father. Stephen Wolf is their stepfather, so I'll do Steve regarding to their father, and Stephen as their ex-stepfather. But Stephen was coming out to the press because he too, like Brett and like Minnie, did not believe Scott had done it. And he pretty much repeated to the press what he had told police, that he didn't believe Scott did this. The financial pressures and like the family drama would not have been enough of a motive for Scott to have suddenly snapped and done this. He said, quote, I know part of what the problems were when I was married. I didn't see that they would be that much of a problem as to cause that kind of response. He reiterated to the press what he did to the police, that he didn't believe that his former stepson, quote, could have that kind of rage in him. He said, quote, there were people he was close to. He was quiet, but people would know if there was something really eating at him. I'm sure he would have told his mother because they were quite close. He also didn't believe this talk of like Scott being overwhelmed about like all the pressure, like running the farm or any of that. Stephen dismissed that as well as a motive. And, he, like he did with police, saying that like, nah, dude, the farm was due for a comeback. Like, there was no stressors there. He was excited. There were even some in the town who said that they didn't even want Sheriff Henry coming out and using language such as like Scott was the perpetrator until they had irrefutable evidence. Like, there were so many people that were not convinced at all that Scott did this. Thus far, the only evidence that the public had been aware of is the fact that the murder weapon was found, according to the two different reports, either in Scott's hand or right next to him. That was the only evidence that police had told the public that they had that pointed to Scott as the shooter. Now, Nick Hess was a local teenager, went to school with Scott. He also helped the family bale hay. And while he agreed, this is kind of interesting, while he agreed with the assessment that, like, Scott was pretty quiet and to himself, he also said, quote, "We knew he was a little weird. He always kept to himself, but we never thought he would do something like that." So thus far, that seemed to be the only assessment of Scott that didn't really jive with, like, the clean-cut farm boy. Like, according to Nick here, he was like, he was a quiet guy, and, that's kind of off-putting to some people. I don't know why some people are so put off, God, by, introverted people or whatever. But, that seemed to be thus far the most negative thing that I could come across of him, is that, like, oh, well, he was kind of quiet and to himself, and that was a little weird. But even Nick here, while he, described Scott that way, was like, even that was sort of like blowing their minds at, like, really? This kid could have done that? So meanwhile, detectives continued working the case and doing their interviews. They spoke with Misty, remember Misty Martin, John Martin's daughter. She had seen Gary and Cheryl the evening before they would be killed, around 6 or 7 that night. And this was after they had milked their cows for the evening. She said she spoke with Kay on the phone that same evening around 7:20 p.m. And she was calling Kay to, like, verify, like, hey, can you still babysit for me? But Kay couldn't. Something had come up, so, it's a good thing Misty called to confirm, and Kay had to cancel on her. And the next morning, on Sunday, Misty had missed a call from Kay's number around 10:05 a.m. There was a voicemail, and when Misty played it back, it was Stacy, but she was very garbled and incoherent. And as we know, she was sitting there bleeding from her gunshot wounds trying to call someone for help, But I think Misty knew that they were partying or whatever, and she assumed that, like, Stacy had just kind of, like, drunk dialed her in the night and just deleted the message and didn't really think anything of it. Melby Ober was also interviewed. Remember, he and Kay had a deal for her to purchase cattle off of him, and he told police about the very last phone conversation that he had with Kay. So apparently Kay had met Melby about 6 to 8 years prior, somewhere around there, and in 2003, they had an agreement for Kay to buy 32 cows from him for $900 a month for 5 months. Melby told police that Kay had fallen about 6 months behind in payments, and again, we went over the financial difficulties the family was experiencing, and he said that he finally received a check from her on May 1st. And on this last conversation that he had with her, which was on May 1st, she talked about, the loan and grant that she had, and she explained to Melby that she planned to buy her parents out of the farm. She wanted to, like, buy out their share of it. And she also mentioned that Scott was going to enroll in diesel mechanics school, and he was going to do that right after high school, and that everything just really seemed on the upswing. She was, like, super stoked for, just life in the next few months. And it was that Sunday evening that police were finally able to interview Brett. He recalled the party that night. Quote, "Everybody was fine. Everyone drank a few beers. Scott and Paige were okay, but Paige was hanging on me a little bit." And his description of Paige's behavior mimicked what Jason was talking about, that she seemed pretty tipsy, pretty intoxicated, and was sort of like, kind of being a little, like, affectionate with everyone. Brett told police that Scott didn't seem like, he minded really all that much. Like, he didn't really seem like it bothered him. And he was adamant that Scott was not drunk at the party. He did not drink at all. He then recounted how he himself had gone to sleep at around 4 a.m. He said Megan was already asleep on the love seat, so he took the couch. And he also said at this time when he lay down, he was pretty sure that Kay's boyfriend Jason had not left the home yet. Now, Brett said he awoke, as we recounted, at 6 a.m. that morning. Quote, "I just shot right up. I woke up out of a dead sleep. It was kind of weird because I went to bed late." He said he went upstairs to gently wake up Kay and just, like, inform her that he was gonna leave. Quote, "She was asleep, but I whispered to her that I was going to get on home because I had chores to do. She got up and walked me to the door, unlocked it, and told me I was welcome to come back for breakfast later once I was done with my chores. She locked the door back up as I left. There was nothing wrong with anybody. Nothing weird." And, they asked Brett to, like, are you sure that you left the home around 6 a.m.? Like, are you positive? Because if you'll remember, Andrew said that he left the home around 7 a.m. and he thought he saw someone sleeping on the couch, a dude. And Brett was like, "No, I am positive that it was, like, just a few minutes after 6 a.m. when I left the house, because I remember getting out my cell phone and looking at it because I wanted to know the time. Because remember, Brett knew he had chores to do. They asked if Andrew's truck was still in the driveway. Andrew had a pretty distinctive, like, Dodge truck with, like, huge smokestacks and stuff. And Brett said, yeah, I remember seeing that truck in the driveway when I left. And if you remember, like, Andrew wasn't even quite sure, when he left or whatever. He thought it was sometime, after 7. And we do know that Brett is saying, well, I left the house around 6, and I know that truck was there. It's very distinct. I know it was still there. And Andrew's saying, well, I left the home like around 7, quarter after, somewhere around there, and there was someone sleeping on the couch. So there's another discrepancy that has cropped up. Police also asked Brett if anyone was asleep in the recliner when he left. If you remember, when they stumbled upon the crime scene, the recliner had like a blanket and stuff on it, and Brett was like, no, nobody was in the recliner at all. It was just me and Megan. Now, when Brett got home, his stepfather, Lee Anderson, did chastise him for staying out all night, but he saw no signs that his stepson had been drinking. Quote, I told him he'd better get his butt moving. There were sheep to feed, cattle to feed, but he appeared to be normal when he got here. His eyes weren't bloodshot. He appeared to have had a full night of sleep. He didn't appear to be anything out of the normal. To be a teenager again. Do you remember that? I remember being able to do that. Like, you out and party, get like maybe an hour or two of sleep, and then you can just get right back to it, right? And no one's none the wiser. To be a kid again. Now, before his interview with police ended, Brett was adamant, all right? Adamant that his friend Scott couldn't have done this. Quote, he wouldn't hurt his grandparents or his mother or sister. He said Scott did not display any signs at all of being troubled the night of the party, in the days or weeks leading up to the murders. Brett didn't see that. Quote, he rarely lost his temper and was generally quiet, except when he was talking about farming. Now, after Brett was interviewed, a couple who actually knew the whole Schaefer family and had even rented property from them at one time came into the sheriff's office the next day on Monday, so May 30th now, and they believed that they had some information that could probably help the police, like, kind of get a feel for the family dynamics going on. This couple was JT and Diana Splon, and they actually rented Wilma's old farmhouse when she died. They rented it from, I believe it was Kay or Gary and Cheryl. But she had been the Schaefer's tenant for a while before she had a falling out, and it caused her to move out, and then she didn't speak to the Schaefers from that moment forward. Diana and JT's son, Dustin, was really good friends with Scott, and through Scott and all that, and being in a small town, they had all known each other for quite some time. But that all changed once the Splons moved out of Wilma's home. Quote, once they had a falling out, they were pretty much enemies, but Stacy and Dustin remained friends. So apparently Dustin and Scott had a falling out after this incident, but Dustin was still friendly with Stacy. So Diana explained the reason for the falling out. Quote, well, we then had a falling out with them. 2 years ago, Sherry Kay had a little party and got my kids drunk. The detectives then asked the Splons if they liked the Schaefers. And Diana just responded, quote, well, Gary Schaefer had called the police and got JT arrested for lying. They were hateful and spiteful. They would lie at any cost. Now, Diana didn't know anything about the .22 rifle, but she assumed the murder weapon would belong to Gary. And, quote, that was the gun Dustin and Scott went out hunting with. So she claimed she didn't know if it was this specific .22 rifle, but she was saying, like, I was pretty sure that was the gun that they took hunting. And she said because Scott was afraid of guns, quote, Grandpa would always keep all of the guns and ammunition at his house. The only gun Scott owned was a double-barrel shotgun, but he was afraid to shoot it. Detective Brugler then asked the Splons if Gary or Cheryl kept guns in their barn, and Diana said that their son Dustin did store his BB gun there, but that was about it, all that they knew of. Now, JT added that he was pretty sure the Schaefers had a .22 in the barn in order to shoot rats, but none of them knew, like, if it was like a Marlin .22 rifle, remember the murder weapon that they found next to Scott / in his hands? They weren't sure about that. They was like, I was pretty sure it was a .22 rifle, but I don't know, like what specific like model or whatever. JT just said, quote, Grandpa would keep all the guns and ammo. If Scott had a gun, he had to go down to his grandpa's to get it. Scott probably blew up since he knew he was graduating and everyone was going to make him do all the work. Now, the Splon said that Dustin would undoubtedly be able to give a little more insight on if Scott felt any pressure because they had been friends for so long. But interestingly enough, Detectives Brugler and Stout would not follow up on anything the Splons said. They never interviewed Dustin at all. The Splons continued in their interview about the Schaefer family dynamics that they knew of, and, what was going on with Wilma's will and all that. Quote, "It was a war, an all-out war." And this was according to Diana. She said that Gary and his daughter Kay had gotten along at one point, but, quote, "Cheryl Schaefer's mother, Wilma, left all of the property to Sherry Kay, and that is why there's been this ongoing dispute. Gary and Cheryl Schaefer thought they should have gotten the farm since they worked it all those years. About the time we moved in, Sherry Kay found a bank that would lend her the money to buy her portion of the farm. No one was paying taxes on the farm. They weren't paid since her great-grandmas died." And when detectives asked, what was the main cause of the fights, the Splons had one word: milking. Diana said that Cheryl, Gary, and Kay all refused to do the milking of the cows, which left it all on Scott. She said Dustin had even helped his friend, too. Quote, "Dustin and Scott were late last year several times for school. Dustin would stay and help Scott just to get it done." And then they asked the Splons about Scott's relationship with his grandparents. What was that like? Diana said that she had several conversations with Scott where he stated he straight up wanted his grandparents to die already. Particularly his grandfather, saying he, quote, "wishes the SOB would just drop dead." She added, quote, "Scott wasn't very fond of his mother either. Everyone was always fighting since Grandma and Grandpa kept the milk checks." She said, in her characterization, she would characterize Scott's relationship with his grandparents, Gary and Cheryl, as a love-hate relationship. She said the grandparents would go out and buy Scott something, and everything would be fine for a while. But eventually, Scott would, trash that thing, whatever it was, and everything would just fall apart again. Quote, "They bought a new mower. He would take it out and tear it up. He would spitefully tear up all of their equipment, ruin it. They would make him bale hay, and he would tear up the equipment." And as Diana went on, she was described as rambling on. She said, quote, "Scott and Sherry Kay didn't get along very well either. Scott would stay with his mom for a while, and then get into it with her and move in with his grandparents. He would get into it with them, and then move back in with his mom. If you ask me, they kind of tugged him back and forth. Mom would buy him a pickup truck, and the grandparents would buy his graduation pictures. Stacy always stayed tight with her mom, though. Stacy and Scott had a typical brother and sister relationship. Scott was sometimes jealous of Stacy due to her and Sherry Kay being so close. Scott would sometimes get mad at Stacy when she sided with her mother. When we first moved in, Scott basically lived with us. He didn't get along with his mom or grandparents, so he stayed with us." And that is when the Splons pretty much ended their interview with Detectives Brugler and Stout, who I guess did not believe anything the Splons had to say. They, for whatever reason, thought everything that the Splons had to say was not credible. And yeah, the Splons, then walked out of the office and were never interviewed again. Dustin was never interviewed or anything like that. Now, right after the Splons left, Detective Cooper then received a phone call. It was from a woman named Cheryl Garland Briggs. And she was the director of New Directions, which was a local counseling service. And she called them, and she just happened to call right after the Splons ended their interview. So Cheryl had called police to inform them about 3 months prior to the massacre, Kay had actually come to New Directions. And she had come there to seek counseling because, according to Cheryl, Kay said that Scott had been abusive. She said that Kay told her that she was worried Scott may kill her and Stacy. That's kind of an interesting tidbit, right? But that was pretty much it. The police did not really follow up further with Cheryl. I don't know if it's because she didn't really have anything else to say or whatnot, but yeah, that's all there is to know about Cheryl, is that, yeah, apparently 3 months prior to, her death, Kay had gone in there claiming that Scott was being abusive. On Tuesday, May 31st, police interviewed even more witnesses who came forward to tell what they knew of the Schaefer Moody, family dynamics and, everything going on with them. One of those witnesses was Scott's ex-girlfriend, 18-year-old Amanda Arthur. Now, if you remember in part 1, we said that Scott had started dating Paige about a week and a half after he had broken up with someone. That someone is Amanda. So she explained that she had dated Scott for almost the entirety of their senior year, but they had broken up about 2 weeks before graduation. And this was because, according to Amanda, Scott Scott had started acting, quote, really weird. She said that she didn't really find herself comfortable being alone with him anymore, and she ended up finding someone else. Quote, I found someone I felt happier with, someone that didn't make me feel as scared. She said that Scott, changed over the course of their relationship. Quote, Scott just became real emotional recently. Sometimes he would just blow up, and other times he would call me crying for no reason. One night, we were all sitting at the kitchen table. Misty and Sherry Kay were talking about things Scott used to do when he was a kid. We were all laughing, but then he just blew up on us. Scott was laughing one minute, and then just blew up the next. He would sometimes just blow up for no apparent reason. She recalled one incident, quote, Thursday night before graduation, the school had a senior awards banquet. Scott was acting really strange. He was acting really withdrawn. Apparently, he was mad at his mother and Stacy. Amanda's parents seemingly, confirmed this behavior and characterization of Scott, saying that he was indeed withdrawn at that ceremony banquet, and he often had his his head in his hands. He wouldn't eat anything, and he didn't really talk. Amanda said that Scott had talked to her throughout that year that they were dating, and told her that his mom wanted to, buy her parents out of the farm, and told her that he would then own the farm when his mom passed away. Quote, he also told me he got along with his grandparents, but Scott did get into it with them sometimes because they were always wanting him to work. He had a lot of stress on him with the farm. His grandparents were always on him. They didn't want him to have a life outside of the farm. Some of the time he talked about killing himself. Scott always told me that if we ever broke up, he was going to commit suicide. He would always say he was going to hurt himself and cut himself. And just a few weeks before the murders and right before they'd broken up, quote, Scott said what he'd always said, if you break up with me, I will hurt myself in some way. But he always said he would never hurt me or his family because he loved us. He told me he would never end up like his dad because his dad cheated on his mom. And maybe that gives a little bit of insight into why Scott decided to stop seeing his father. Remember, Kay, always talks shit about Steve to her children, and maybe this is something that she told him that, he cheated on her or whatever. I don't know if that happened. It wouldn't surprise me. We went over how Kay and Steve started, very young, 2 young kids at a young age, so I don't know if there were any cheating or what, but yeah, that is what Amanda told police. Now, after they'd broken up, Amanda said the last time she had spoken to Scott was, quote, after graduation practice, I talked with Scott, and he said he was happy with his new girlfriend, Paige. He said he was happy that I had someone else too. He told me he just wanted to be friends and get along. She said Kay had always liked her, but Gary and Cheryl did not. Quote, they thought Scott could do a lot better than me. Yeah, real lovely, right? Amanda was asked about any guns that she knew of in the house. Quote, there were some guns in the house. There was a gun in the corner by the microwave. It was a brown long gun. She explained about Scott's routine, how he never milked the cows in the morning. He always preferred to do it in the evening. Quote, but he hadn't done it for a while because he had hernia surgery. He did help out some, but not much. So that was what Scott's ex-girlfriend had to say about Scott. What do you think about what Amanda has to say? It's definitely interesting, right? We have heard this characterization of Scott's behavior before, right? Where he seemed like he was seemingly fine one minute and then the next he would snap, And I feel like that can be explained in numerous ways. He's a teenager. I know I certainly cringe at some of the behavior I exhibited as a teenager, right? It's an angsty, crappy time, He could have had some sort of maybe mood or behavioral disorder that explained it. Maybe he was depressed. Maybe there's some sort of mental explanation. But so far, that seems to be the most dark thing about Scott that we know of, right? Is that he seemingly could blow up at any time, be fine one minute and not fine the next. And after Amanda was interviewed, detectives then interviewed Roger Tangerman, and he was the last tenant that police needed to interview. Remember we spoke about this in the last video. Wilma and her family, the Schaefer family, had many, many properties all around town and all throughout the area, and they rented/leased out a lot of these properties. So police, of course, were interviewing every tenant that the Schaefers had. Just, as you do, right? Makes sense. They can maybe give some scope into the family dynamics, what they thought, etc., etc. Well, Roger here was the last tenant they needed to interview. Roger knew Gary and Cheryl, knew their routine. He spoke about how you could set your watch by their routine, and said that he had grown, somewhat close to Gary. He spoke with him often. He said he couldn't talk too much about the family dynamics. They never really had, those kind of talks, nothing kind of emotional or anything like that. But he did say that he did know Scott. Scott used to come around and hang out with him for, quite a while. But he said Scott eventually stopped hanging out so much, and he chalked it up to, he's a teenager, he's getting older, wants to hang out with, kids his own age, doesn't want to listen to a couple of, old timers, talking about stuff. That's what Roger thought. And he said that he never heard of or saw any arguments between Scott and Gary. He couldn't speak to that. And he said that Gary never brought up Scott to him. Roger said that he did have one small run-in with Scott. I think it was in the days or weeks leading up to the murder. I don't know about the specific details, but he talked about how Scott had almost run him off the road. So I don't know if Scott was maybe driving recklessly or what. And Roger said that he did confront Scott and his friend that he was with about it, and they did get a little mouthy with him. And he did tell Gary and Cheryl about it, but he said that was it. That was sort of the end of it. And he also said he didn't really know Kay all that well, and he didn't really know anything about, guns or anything like that. He couldn't speak to that. He did recall that Sunday morning. He said since he woke up late and got kind of a late start to his morning, he did not see Gary or Cheryl, who would have, already done their milking by the time he got up and about. He said later that morning, he and his family did hear sirens, and then saw police cars shortly thereafter. And Roger told detectives, quote, "I know things might have been bad, but I don't believe Scott would have taken out his entire family." Roger did say, though, that thinking back, that Sunday morning, he did see something that was a little unusual. He said he was looking out his front window that morning and he saw a car pull into Gary and Cheryl's driveway. He said 2 men got out. One went to the front door, and the other man, a gray-haired man, went around to the side of the house, toward the barn in the back. Now, Roger said that he took note of the second man because he thought it was a little unusual that the gray-haired man was only in a t-shirt, and he thought it was still pretty chilly in the morning to just be going out in a t-shirt. Roger said that he left his window to go get some coffee, and by the time he came back, he noticed that only one of the men was getting back in the car, and then the car left. And he was pretty certain that only one man had gotten in the vehicle. Now, Roger said he didn't know these men, didn't know the car right off the bat, didn't know if maybe they had gotten lost and needed directions, but he just thought it was strange that he had never, seen them before that morning. Quote, he could have just been a family member, but yeah, he just thought, I feel like I should, let you guys know. And the detectives did not press Roger any further on what he saw, did not ask him any further questions about this car and these seemingly 2 strange men who had walked up to Gary and Cheryl's house. And they also never dug further into anything that Roger had told them. So, all this is going on. Let's go a little bit into Stacy, the lone survivor of the massacre, all right? So, we said she went to the hospital in Columbus with gnarly injuries. She was in critical condition, but she pulled through. She miraculously survived, all right? My Lord, I can't imagine going through that. It's amazing. Some of the wounds and injuries that people can survive. It's absolutely incredible. On Wednesday, June 1st, Stacy's physicians then gave police the okay for them to interview her. They're okay, she's in a stable enough condition and she's able to speak with you now. But for some reason, all right, the sheriff's office did not immediately dispatch someone to go interview Stacy. All right, they just kind of sat on it. However, there was a Logan County coroner who did go and interview Stacy as soon as physicians gave the okay. This coroner was Dr. Michael Thaler. And the reason he wanted to go skedaddle and talk to Stacy is he needed to complete some sort of paperwork on his end. I don't know how the coroners and medical examiners, I don't know how all that works. All the book said was that Dr. Thaler had some paperwork that he needed to process and finish, and he needed to speak to Stacy to kind of complete that paperwork. So, as soon as her physicians gave the green light, he hightailed it to Columbus to interview her. So when Dr. Thaler talked to Stacy, he asked her if she knew who had shot her. She replied that she didn't remember what had awoken her that Sunday morning, but she did, wake up, and when she opened her eyes, she saw a man standing over her bed, and he was holding a gun that had a, quote, huge barrel. She said the man proceeded to shoot her in the neck and then walked out of her bedroom. And then she said she heard 2 more shots. She said the man then came back into her room, stood over her again with the gun, and she said that she remembered at this point trying to squirm and get out of the way. But, as we know, that didn't do much good, and she was shot again, and this time she felt a surge of pain. She said she laid there as he walked out, and then she heard 2 more gunshots. Now, already, right, Dr. Thaler is, getting her testimonial here, and he's disturbed by what he's hearing, right? Because he's expecting her to describe someone like her brother, or to say, like, I saw my brother, but, like, she's saying, like, no, there was a strange man standing over my bed and shot me. And so he was already kind of getting disturbed by what he was hearing. And so he tried to, like, prod Stacy a little bit further, like, okay, describe this man for me. Like, who was this guy? Because, he figured, like, well, she'll probably describe someone like her brother. She, got shot, like, like in the head area, and she's going through a lot of trauma. Like, she'll probably describe someone who will, sound like her brother. But Stacy told Dr. Thaler that the man was older, had short gray hair, and was wearing a blue t-shirt. She said she couldn't remember if he had any facial hair or not, and couldn't really remember any other detail besides that, like, he seemed to have, like, a bigger build. Like, he was pretty, like, thick. Not fat, of course, like ripped, muscular, like a thicker, bigger frame. And as she started to struggle to maintain consciousness, I think she was getting pretty tired at this point, she was adamant to Dr. Thaler that she had never before seen this guy, had no idea who he was, he didn't look familiar at all. And she was pretty adamant about it. And I'm a little unclear when this exchange happened. The book didn't do a clear job of recounting when exactly this happened, but at some point, Dr. Thaler had a minor confrontation with Steve's lawyer. Apparently, Dr. Thaler wanted to be alone to interview Stacy, and Steve's lawyer was adamant that, like, you're not going to be interviewing a minor with no one else in the room. Are you high? And, the lawyer told him, quote, if you want to ask Stacy, a minor, questions, a parent representative is going to be present. So I was a little confused if the lawyer or Steve or Audrey had sat in on Dr. Thaler's interview with Stacy. I'm going to imagine they did, right? Like, I wouldn't let my minor child be interviewed by anyone alone without some sort of, if I couldn't be there, some sort of, parental representative. Now, later this same day on Wednesday, after she had had some time to recover, Stacy spoke to her stepmother, Audrey, and she told her stepmother about the events that had led up to that Sunday morning. So that Saturday night, Stacy said that she and her mother had gone to Bell Fountain to do some shopping, and later they, along with Scott, went to a graduation party. This was a graduation party being held at a friend's house. That friend was Tom Coy. After they stopped by Tom's house for a little bit, Scott and Stacy then took Kay home, and then they stopped by another friend's house. This friend was Amy Hall, and then after Amy's, they went and picked up Paige, who was going to be staying at Kay's home for a few days while her father was out of town. He was going to be hunting with some friends in Michigan. Remember we talked about how Scott had gone to Paige's home to help her with some chores while her father was gone? I'm guessing this was part of it, so she was just going to stay with Kay for a few days. Scott, Stacy, and Paige then went to that large party that I talked about. Remember the party that was held for all of the seniors, and it got super, kind of out of control and big? Well, this party was for classmates Wes Clem and Parker Robinson, and I wasn't sure if this was at one of their houses or whatever, but this party started for just these two, and then it grew to encompass the entire graduating class. After about an hour there, Stacy said that Scott and Paige left that party to go get some party supplies, while Stacy, stayed behind and hung out some more. And by the time Scott and Paige had returned, that's when the party had grown exponentially, and that's when Scott wanted to just take off and go home. So Scott invited, of course, himself, Stacy, and Paige, along with Megan and Brett, over to his house to hang out. And that was all Stacy was able to recount to Audrey before she had to take another break. And as Audrey stepped out of Stacy's hospital room, that is when detectives Stout and Brugler appeared to interview Stacy. And I'm going to guess they allowed her to rest before they went in and interviewed her. So in the taped interview with Detectives Brugler and Stout, Stacy pretty much reiterated what she did to Dr. Thaler. She didn't know why she had woken up that Sunday morning, but when she did, there was a strange man standing over her bed holding a gun with a, quote, huge barrel. She said he shot her in the neck, and as she lay there dazed, quote, the guy walked out of my bedroom, and then I heard 2 more shots. The man then came back into my room and shot me a second time. He then walked out, and I heard 2 more shots. She said she wasn't sure, but she thought the man man had left after that. She repeated her earlier physical description of the man and said that she believed that she passed out from shock after she was shot the second time. When she came to, she said that was when she went to go find her mom. And she remembered that when she found her mom, there was blood coming out of her mouth. She said that she then went into her brother's room and she remembered seeing Scott with what she thought was a 410 shotgun that was in his hand and pointing up towards his face. She said she remembered blood being splattered all over the walls. She said that she stumbled downstairs and she remembered that it was extremely difficult getting down the stairs. And she said once she was in the family room, she stumbled and knocked a bunch of stuff askew. She said that she remembered seeing Megan on the love seat, not moving, and she remembered screaming at Megan to wake up, but of course she wouldn't. Stacy then told officers at that point she didn't really feel any more pain, and she remembered dropping into the recliner and passing out / blacking out or going to sleep. She didn't remember. She said when she woke up, she stumbled and found her way to the downstairs bathroom, and this would be the first time that she saw her face in the mirror. Now, she said when she first saw her face, she thought maybe someone had played a prank on her when she was passed out. She thought maybe her friend John Martin. But as she stared at her face longer, she said she realized oh my God, I'd been shot, and she knew that her friend John Martin would never do that. She knew he would never do that because he was a second father to her. She said the man that she had awoken to standing over her bed that morning reminded her of John because he was older and had gray hair. She said she remembered getting her phone and she remembered trying to get a hold of someone, but she didn't know who to call. She said she called a few other people and no one picked up, and so finally she decided to try and call Nikki. And she said the next thing she remembered was Nikki and Jeff arriving at the home. And when the detectives asked her what weapons she had in her home, Stacy said that she herself only knew of 3 weapons in the home: a 410, a 12 gauge, and a 20 gauge. She said the 410 was under her mother's bed and the other 2 were in the corner by the microwave. She was then asked about, of course, the 22 rifle. And Stacy said if that weapon had been involved, that it probably more than likely belonged to her grandfather. And it was at this point that Stacy kind of just became too weak to go on, so they had to cut the interview with Stacy right there. By Thursday of that week, June 2nd, the motive behind Scott's actions, if it was Scott, remained unknown, and Sheriff Henry told the press, quote, "We've concluded we may never know what caused Scott Moody to commit this crime," and cited that a number of reasons and issues could have set him off. And just kind of recapped with, what we've already talked about with what kind of theories had been put out there. Now, Stephen, though, Scott's former stepfather, was still asking the public to wait for everything to come to light before judging his former stepson too harshly. Quote, "I guess I'm looking to get some answers so that people start thinking differently about Scott. I'm not satisfied that he's at fault. I'm not blaming anyone else. I would just like to have these things answered." And at this point, police told the press that they were awaiting toxicology reports, ballistic tests, and other forensic tests to come in. And until they got the results of these tests, the motive behind Scott's actions would remain largely unknown. Quote, "We hope we can start some semblance of a healing process for our community and the families." Meanwhile, in the hospital in Columbus, detectives were able to re-interview Stacy, and she would later say that at this point, during her second interview, she was kind of getting tired of answering the same questions. She felt like no one was really listening to her. She was getting frustrated specifically of them asking, "Who shot you? Who shot you?" She was getting frustrated because she repeatedly described the older gray-haired man with the blue t-shirt and the larger build. But that was really the only details she could remember, She would later describe trying to remember, even that morning, let alone what the guy looked like, as trying to remember a dream, And you've had that, right? Where whether it's a really good or a really bad dream, right? When you're in between that sleep and awake, you can pretty much recall the dream pretty much point by point, right? But the more you wake up, it's like sand slipping through your fingers, right? It's really hard to remember. So, I can only imagine, especially if she was a little tipsy, I can only imagine going to bed only a few hours ago, probably a little intoxicated, so you're probably in a deep sleep or whatever, and then all of a sudden this wakes you up. Yeah, that'd probably probably be really difficult to remember, like, minutiae details like that. Detective Stout then asked Stacy, quote, describe the gun you saw your brother holding. And Stacy would later say that she was kind of confused by the phrasing of this question, and that's a pretty leading question, right? Like, I know that there are rules when detectives are interviewing witnesses and victims and stuff, right? Like, you can't ask them with any leading questions, right? That is something that a good defense attorney is going to, bring up in court, right? So yeah, Stacy was immediately put off by the phrasing of that question. Like, describe the gun you saw your brother holding. And Stacy was also confused because the gun that she saw pointed at her when she woke up all of a sudden looked like a pump gun that, like, had a huge barrel with a wood stock. Like, she could have swore that's what it looked like to her. She said she actually thought it resembled a gun that she had seen Scott go deer hunting with. She repeated once again who she saw standing over her. And she was beginning, she's smart. She's picking up, like, these questions have implications that my brother somehow had something to do with this. And that's not true. And before they had to end the second interview with Stacy because, she was getting weaker, she just repeated, quote, the man I saw was not my brother. So since Stacy had brought up his name, of course, John Martin was interviewed, right? Like, she said the guy standing over her resembled John Martin because he was older and gray and had gray hair, which I get that, right? Like, when you see someone, especially if, they have characteristics that are similar to someone your brain automatically is like, oh yeah, they remind me of so-and-so. But, we're dealing with a murder here. So yeah, they went to interview John Martin. Now, John confirmed for police that Stacy had tried to call him that Sunday morning. He said he was fueling up his tractor when his cell phone rang. He said that he couldn't make out who it was, so he got off his tractor and he was going to check his phone for the number. Quote, little Stacy's the one who calls me daddy. I heard daddy, and I said, Stacy, I can't understand you. Since the signal seemed weak, I told Stacy I could get with her later, explaining I had to get the crops in. Later on, Steve Wolf called me, asking if I heard that there was a shooting at the Schaefer farm. My daughter Misty lives in one of the rental properties on the farm, so I called her to see what was going on. I don't know what Stacy was trying to say to me, like maybe help or something. Now, when asked how long it had been from the time that Stacy called him that morning, from the time that Stephen Wolf called him, John replied, quote, probably about a half an hour. John, of course, denied any involvement in the shooting, denied shooting anyone, just saying, quote, no, I wouldn't hurt that little girl. The last time I was over there was on Friday. They had pups, and I went over there to see them. He was asked about his timeline again, asked about that phone call from Stacy again, and John said at first he didn't know it was Stacy who was calling him. He said he didn't immediately recognize the number, even though it was Kay's number that Stacy was calling from. I believe Stacy, I think I said this in the last video, when Stacy had gone to check her mother and, wake her up, she grabbed her mother's cell phone as well. John said he didn't know anything about a .22 rifle. And, when police asked, like, oh, would your prints ever, be on the .22 rifle that was used? He said, like, no, there would be no reason for his prints to be found anywhere on the gun. And another reason detectives asked this is, like, remember, he was with Kay for 2 years and lived in the same house as her. And so, like, yeah, they were like, well, would your fingerprints be, cropping up here or there? And so, of course, he was like, well, yeah, like, my prints will probably be, like, on the stairwell or something. But he said, yeah, there wouldn't be any reason for his prints to be on any of the weapons in the home. Now, when asked if he knew of anyone who'd want to do something like this to Kay or the family, John did express concerns about Stephen Wolf. Quote, Steve Wolf was the reason I moved out of the house. Now, whatever John said about Stephen, like why he suspected him or what was going on there, will never be known because for some reason, this part of John's interview was deleted from all the police reports. So yeah, the only people who know what went on after that is John and the detectives questioning him. The detectives then asked John if he thought Scott could have done this. And John said, quote, I really don't think so. He said that he did hear like a lot of crazy, unsubstantiated rumors around town, one of which was that Scott and Stacy supposedly told a bunch of people that they wouldn't be around for graduation. Quote, it was a rumor only. I don't remember who even told me. John said he would indeed take a polygraph test if needed. The police asked him if he would consent to one. He said he had no problem, and he was never given one. John said he'd last spoken with Kay that Friday and that she didn't mention anything strange. Quote, I know about the family history. When old lady Buroker died, there was a trust set up where money was supposed to go into an education fund. Sherry Kay talked about someone from the Attorney General's office called her regarding the fact that there wasn't any money in the fund. Sherry Kay told me she was getting a loan to put money into the account and pay the farm taxes. Now, much, much later, all right, I think years later, John would admit that he did omit a small part of what he had witnessed that Sunday morning to detectives. John would later say that Sunday morning, he had seen an older, gray-haired man walking across the back of his property. He was headed towards Kay's house, and this guy was wearing a blue t-shirt. Now, looking back at that moment much later and knowing what he would know in the future, John later said that he thought to himself, quote, "It was the fixer. If he had seen me that morning, I'm as good as dead." Yeah, so keep this mysterious character, for lack of a better term, in your mind, the fixer. So that same evening, Paige's memorial began, and her loved ones viewed her at the Rexer Riggin Madden Funeral Home, and her funeral would be held the next afternoon on Friday, and over 100 people attended to pay their last respects. Press and media were barred from the event, and they had to actually, stay a certain amount of feet away, across the street from everything that was going on. Paige was ultimately buried in Greenwood Union Cemetery, which was located in DeGraff. And the next day, on Saturday, June 4th, Megan was buried at the Huntsville Cemetery, and this was after nearly 100 people also attended her services to pay their last respects to her. Her services were held at the Gretna Brethren Church, which was located just outside of DeGraff. And the same funeral home also handled Megan's arrangements as well. And then on Sunday, June 5th, the preliminary autopsy report on Scott was released. It was specifically released by the Columbus Dispatch newspaper. Dr. Lee Lehman, who was a forensic pathologist who worked with the coroner's office, was the one who conducted the autopsy on Scott. Now, according to the autopsy, the medical examiner had found gunshot wounds just below Scott's left ear and through the right side of the roof of his mouth. Now, according to the report, the first bullet had lodged into Scott's sinuses, so investigators believed that is when Scott switched hands, changed his position on the bed, and fired the second fatal shot that would kill him. The second bullet ended up lodged into the right frontal lobe of his brain, and authorities said that the first shot he fired wasn't fatal because the weapon lacked enough power to do that. Experts started weighing in on this, and they said, though it is rare for people who shoot themselves to do it twice, it does happen. Quote, "There are people who are about to commit suicide. They flinch for one reason or another. The wound is not immediately incapacitating, and then they finish the job off." And this was according to Dr. Richard Callery, who was the then chief medical examiner for the state of Delaware, and he co-wrote an article on multiple suicidal gunshot wounds in the American Journal of Forensic Medicine and Pathology. So that's why this guy was interviewed by a bunch of papers to kind of get his, take on that, since he's written an article and seemed pretty knowledgeable about suicide by gunshot wounds when it's more than one shot. In Scott's case, the first shot, the one that was below the left ear, was a close range but not a contact shot. And the second shot, the one that went through the right side of the roof of his mouth, had an upward trajectory. Now, investigators concluded that the second fatal shot indicated that Scott was indeed the shooter, and they theorized that he shot himself once in the neck, below the left ear, and then probably switched hands before firing that fatal shot through the roof of his mouth. That was their theory. Meanwhile, a deputy coroner for the Montgomery County Coroner's Office conducted autopsies on the other 5 victims. And in his findings, he noted that Gary Schaefer had suffered 3 gunshot wounds in the neck behind his ear. Cheryl had been shot once in the neck, behind her ear, and once in the face. And the other 3 victims were all shot at close range, with the gun placed close to or against the skin, hence the theory that everyone in Kay's house was asleep as they were shot. Kay was shot once in her left temple, Paige was shot once in her left temple, and Megan was shot once in the right side of her neck, below her ear. Now, after the details, of these autopsy reports, specifically Scott's, was released to the public, oh man, everyone had something to say. People were like, what? And there were so many further questions. First of all, I remember when I first came across this, it was before I read the book, and I was just going by the newspaper articles, and I came across this, and I was like, wait, what? He shot himself twice? Killed himself twice? Really? And again, Dr. Callery's stuff notwithstanding, there will be some other things that we'll get into that is just sort of really? Is that really how Scott did himself in? It's very bizarre and weird. There were other questions that people had too, such as wait, there were how many people in Kay's house? They were all shot in their sleep? How did nobody wake up after the first shot? How about the second shot? And those were some of the questions I had too. I was like, wait a minute. How could nobody in Kay's house wake up after that first shot or even the first two? Like, that's kind of weird, right? Gunshots are loud. It's not like in the movie. Even if you have a silencer, it doesn't sound like it does in the movies, right? So that's pretty bizarre. And you could probably guess, well, a lot of people were drunk when they passed out. Okay, but Kay wasn't. She didn't drink. So yeah, I don't know. That was just one of the many questions that people had. People also asked, like, wait a minute. All these shots that everyone died from, that is a pretty efficient, apparently, way of killing someone. How would Scott not only know that, how would he be so accurate? Because everyone was like, wait, like, Scott had done, like, deer hunting here and there, but, like, he primarily was not really about guns. He wasn't that great of a shot. And so people were like, wait a minute, how did he so methodically kill all these people? That's weird. But then he had to shoot himself twice. And it was really all these gunshots, behind the ear. Apparently, that is, like, I guess the most, like, efficient way to kill someone, apparently. And, like, a lot of people were like, did y'all know that? I didn't know that. And they were like, yeah, no, I didn't know that. How the hell would this 18-year-old kid who wasn't even that really into guns, wasn't a good shot, how would he even know that? And then even if he knew that, how would he be able to be so accurate with all of his shots, People also asked, like, okay, if this was Scott, what could have triggered him in the mere minutes, hour or two after Brett and Andrew left the home that he would just do all that? And if he did have problems with his mother and grandparents, because we've talked about that, what on earth would cause him to shoot his friend, girlfriend, and sister? You know what I mean? Like, these were just some of the many questions that people had that police still had not answered. Scott, Kay, Gary, and Cheryl ended up all having a combined funeral, and it was held the following Monday on June 6th at the family church, the United Methodist Church. And the same funeral home also arranged their funerals and stuff. And about 150 people showed up to pay their last respects. I thought it was very interesting that they had Scott, they had his memorial and burial along with his grandparents and mother. I mean, I feel like that speaks volumes that, even Scott's family were like, we don't think he did this. Apparently, Gary's brother, so Kay's uncle, Ron Schaefer, was so overcome with emotion that he couldn't even finish his statement and his son had to finish it for him. So Ron chose to have Gary, Cheryl, and Kay cremated, whereas I guess what happens to Scott's body was Steve's choice, which makes sense. He was the biological father. And Steve decided to have an open casket funeral for Scott, and he was buried at the same cemetery as Paige. So as we just discussed, all right, the same funeral home handled all of the funeral arrangements and stuff for all the victims, including Scott. But what is interesting is the funeral's director, all right, took Steve Moody aside and was like, hey, as I was embalming Scott's body, quote, I've been doing this for years, and I've handled several suicides. Based on what I know, Scott using a rifle, the entry wound behind his ear, there's no way Scott could have shot himself. Isn't that interesting? Super interesting. So on Thursday, June 9th, Stacy was well enough to be released from the hospital, and it was reported in the press that she wasn't able to tell authorities much, as she had been dead asleep when her brother had massacred everyone. Sheriff Henry said, quote, she needs time to deal with it. She hasn't been able to give us any more than we already know, which I thought was super interesting, because again, I read the newspaper articles first, all right? And so I was like, oh wow, I guess, Stacy wasn't really able to tell him anything. And then we, read the book and we find out that she has said to Nikki, Dr. Thaler, to Audrey, Detectives Brugler and Stout that she had woken up to this older gray-haired man standing over her and it wasn't her brother. And I thought that was super interesting. Not a peep of that in the newspapers, guys. Not that I could find anyway, or that's been uploaded. Stacy moved in with Steve and Audrey, of course, and she was under strict orders to only eat soft foods or she could choke, guys. Because remember, like, her vocal cords were damaged too, and oh my god, like, the home care that she needed after getting out of the hospital was wild. Stacy had a feeding tube in her nose. She had to stay hooked up to a machine that provided her nourishment, and she had another machine to suction her mouth. She also had to wear a brace that covered her head and torso, and it forced her head to stare like straight ahead. Yeah, she had to wear one of those. She also had a bullet exit wound in her right cheek that would still like leak and stuff. Like, isn't that awful? On top of all that, Stacy still had a bullet inside of her, and doctors told her if it had gone just a fraction of an inch any other direction, Stacy would have been instantly paralyzed. But at this point, Stacy was in no condition to have the bullet removed. Yeah, isn't that scary? 15 years old, guys. And as doctors gave the okay, family members started, particularly Steve and Audrey, started breaking to Stacy what exactly happened. Up until this point, they had kept pretty much all the details away from Stacy. She didn't know that her mother was dead, that Paige and Megan were dead. She had no idea that Scott was being blamed for it. She had no idea. And unsurprisingly, when she was told all this, she fell into a deep, deep depression. But her family did get her personal counseling. And 5 days later, on Tuesday, June 14th, Detective Stout and Brugler came to the Moody home to interview Stacy once again. This interview would end up lasting 45 minutes, and Detective Stout bluntly told the family, quote, either we have a killer on the loose or Scott did this. And without letting anyone respond, Stout then went over all of the evidence they had that pointed to Scott and finally said, quote, we need to get to the truth, Stacy. I believe you know what happened, and I need you to tell us what you know. Right now, we're looking for a gray-haired man. He pressed her further when she didn't, immediately respond and said, quote, you need to tell me the story one more time, and then it's over, so long as you're telling me the truth. And after interrupting her to tell her to speak up, Stacy then went on, quote, my dad told me yesterday you were coming out. I've thought a lot about this. The more I think about it, I don't remember seeing a gray-haired man. I remember seeing a dark figure with a blue shirt on, with the gun shooting at me, and I remember trying to get away. I don't remember seeing a face. I remember getting up after that. I remember 2 shots after that. Then he shot me again. I don't really remember hearing any shots after that. Stout asked her if she remembered at all, and she said, quote, I don't remember. I remember getting up and going downstairs. I was falling everywhere. I remember sitting back down on a chair and going back to sleep for a little bit. And Stout just said, quote, I don't want you to just say something to get me to stop talking to you. We need the truth. And Stacy just continued on, quote, I remember seeing Scott lying on his bed. I don't remember seeing him up moving around. They then pivoted and asked Stacy about being in the downstairs bathroom. But Stacy just said, quote, I don't remember being in the bathroom. Stout then said that he was impressed with the details that Stacy could remember. He went over them again, harping specifically on the downstairs bathroom. Quote, our concern is that Scott was up with you after you were shot. Either he was in the bathroom with you or he helped you into your chair. And Stacy was very, very confused at this point. And Stout just continued on, quote, the worst thing you can do is hold something back. You will carry this inside you for the rest of your life. If there is something in there, you just need to get it out. And Stacy just replied to him, quote, I remember getting up out of bed. I was having trouble going down the stairs. I fell when I was downstairs. I fell into the counter, knocking pictures over. I saw Megan lying there and figured she was just sleeping. I sat down in the chair and fell asleep. And after going over her story, yet again, Stout told Stacy, quote, how can you recall everything so clearly, but you can't remember this guy? That's why we're struggling with believing you didn't see the suspect. It appears that you were up while the shooter was up. I promise we won't close this case until we know who the shooter is. If it was Scott, we need to know. Which just cracks me up, because it's like, hey, idiot, she was shot in, the fucking face. If you remember, most of the details that she's able to remember is, after getting out of bed. You know what I mean? I don't know. I just thought this guy was way out of line. He's just acting like a country bumpkin yokel, and we'll get into it. We'll get all into it specifically in the next video, that there is a lot of incompetence in the Logan County Sheriff's Office. But Stacy, after everything, told Stout, quote, I didn't see Scott. You didn't see a gray-haired man? That's what he asked her. And she just responded, quote, I didn't see a gray-haired man. She said she only remembered a dark figure with a medium build and a blue t-shirt. That was what she knew for sure. She talked about the relationship she had with her brother. Quote, me and Scott got along pretty good. We had our problems like brothers and sisters. It was more my mom and him. Scott was excited because Grandma, Grandpa, and my mom were looking at trucks for him. He was excited about graduation also. They talked about the gun that was used, the .22 rifle. Stacy repeated what she knew of the 3 guns in the home. And then, after thinking for a moment, she said Dave Cusick, remember, one of Kay's boyfriends, did have a gun up at the house as well. Quote, I'm not sure whether he took it home or not. I think it was a .22. It was the gun he carried when he went hunting. He used it to shoot rabbits. And that's when the detectives looked at each other. Apparently, they had not heard this specific detail yet. They then moved on to a wide range and variety of topics before steering the conversation back to Scott, and specifically the events of that Sunday morning. Quote, Stacy, we're looking for closure, and we're not closing this case until we are sure. Is there anything else you can recall since we've been talking? And Stout pressed her after she didn't respond after a second. Quote, I really believe there's something else you want to to tell us. And Stacy denied this. Quote, "No, I'm just trying to think the morning through. I'm trying to remember if I heard anything. My alarm clock was going off. I remember turning my alarm clock off and going back to sleep. I don't know what woke me up. When I did wake up, he was standing in front of my window with a gun. I don't remember a face. I remember a dark figure. I remember the gun shot at me. Then I heard 2 more gunshots. Then he shot me again. I don't remember any shots after that," she went on. Quote, "I remember saying no, no, no to him and fighting. I tried to roll out of the way," she repeated, going into her mom's room. Quote, "She was tucked in real well. It wasn't right. Normally she's all over the place. It was weird seeing her like that, the blanket tucked under her chin, her hand resting gently across her chest. I went in and said, 'Mom, wake up, wake up.' I was yelling at her, but she wouldn't move, and then I saw blood coming out of her mouth." They talked to Stacy about the family feud and the will and all of that, like, drama going on, told her what Amanda and the others had to say about Scott, and as the conversation died down, Stout told Stacy, quote, "I've been to your house. I know your mother. I know your grandparents. I know Scott. I hope to have a special bond with you that will last both of our lifetimes." Yeah, this is a grown-ass man saying this to a 15-year-old traumatized teenager. Now, apparently at this, specific comment, Stacy, physically drew back. And I guess literally everyone in the room, was just very taken aback by this comment that he would make to this 15-year-old girl, when someone says something and the whole room goes dead silent and you can feel the tension in the air. That's how this moment was. But finally, Detective Brugler was able to steer the conversation forward. Quote, "Let's talk about Dave Cusick growing marijuana at your mom's place." But before Stacy could answer, Stout reached over and turned the recorder off, which even Brugler was like, "Why did you do that?" So we don't know what Stacy's response was or why Stout did that. And it was after this right here that Stout stood up and announced that this interview was over. That's weird. But then, when the detectives went back to the office and were typing up the report, Audrey called them and said that Stacy was hysterical and that they needed to come back to the house immediately. And when they got there, they found Stacy was sobbing and she was crying. Quote, "I'm starting to remember things. I remember what seems like a flashback. Scott and Paige were arguing and I could hear them. I don't remember walking around with him, but I do remember it was Scott. I remember waking up and seeing the gun." They asked if she saw Scott. Stacy cried even harder, and after a few moments, she continued on, speaking about her grandparents. Specifically, quote, "Scott had a key to Grandma and Grandpa's house. Scott probably went down there with the four-wheeler. The four-wheeler is smaller and quieter than his truck. Grandma would come back to the house while Grandpa finished milking. Grandma normally started fixing breakfast. That is what they did when I was little. Grandpa would come back into the kitchen when he finished milking and would sit down and eat his breakfast. Scott probably came in before they got back from the barn where they were milking and locked the house back up. There were places he could hide in the house. He probably came out and did it. If he shot them, he would have to have blood on his hands. Then he probably came back up to our house. I'm sure he probably shot me first because I don't remember hearing any other gunshots beforehand. He shot me, and then I heard 2 other gunshots. Then he came back and shot me again." They asked Stacy if she knew it was Scott the second time she was shot, and Stacy replied with yes. They asked her what color shirt Scott was wearing, and she didn't remember that. They asked her what happened next. Quote, "He probably went down and shot Megan." They asked if she knew this, and Stacy just said, quote, "No, after the second gunshot, I don't remember anything. I blacked out." Stout asked her if she at any time saw Scott awake, alive, or moving at any time, specifically any time after the second time she was shot. And Stacy just said, quote, "No." And Stout pressed her further, quote, "The only person that can say Scott shot you for sure was you, Stacy. You saw him shoot you for sure?" And Stacy shook her head yes. Quote, "Did Scott say anything to you?" Stacy hesitated and then said no. Quote, "Was he in the bathroom with you?" Stacy said she couldn't remember. They asked her if Scott helped her into the recliner downstairs. She said no. Stout then asked Stacy about this argument that Scott and Paige supposedly had. Quote, "It was in a flashback. Paige was telling Scott to put it down or something like that." And Stacy said this right here, she couldn't even be 100% certain if it was even a real memory or part of a dream or something. Quote, "I don't know. It could be. All I remember is Paige saying something like, 'Put it down,' or something." And Brugler then asked Stacy to clarify, to her, what was a flashback. When Scott shot her, quote, "I saw Scott shoot me." And Stacy at that point began breaking down and crying, and though the detectives tried getting more from her, they just couldn't. And so this 4th interview with Stacy came to an end. And then on June 21st, the detectives returned to the Moody household for a 5th and final interview with Stacy. Audrey told them, quote, "Stacy hasn't been acting right since she talked with you last week." They entered the home, and Stacy told them, quote, "I told you it was Scott, although I really didn't see him." They tried engaging Stacy and talking about about the events. Apparently she would speak easily about some things and some topics, but whenever the conversation steered towards Scott, she would get upset, not want to talk about it, not want to talk at all. Stacy then said, quote, "When I woke up, I saw Scott standing over me with a gun. Initially, I didn't realize who it was or what was going on. I thought it was some kind of a joke. I realized it was Scott, and then he shot me. Then he left my room, and I heard 2 more shots. There was some separation between the 2 shots, as if he went from one room to another. A short time later, he came back into my bedroom and shot me again. I think I passed out, but I'm not sure for how long. When I woke up, I walked downstairs, stumbling, and sat down in the recliner. At some point, I looked beside the chair and saw Scott's leg kneeling beside me. He was wearing black wind pants." Stout again asked Stacy if she was just telling them what they wanted to hear so that they would leave her alone. Quote, "This is the truth. I know Scott shot everyone. I saw him shoot me. I just don't want to believe it in my head." And Stout finally told her, quote, "Stacy, if you change your story anymore, then it might be necessary for you to take a polygraph to get to the truth." And she said, quote, "That won't be necessary. I've told you everything." And later that same day, authorities officially announced to the public that they had closed Scott's case. And they concluded that Scott Moody was indeed the shooter. Prosecutor Gerald Heaton told the press, quote, "All of the gunshots came from the same weapon, and that was the weapon that Scott Moody was holding when, officers arrived on scene." And this was before the written reports of the State Bureau of Criminal Investigation and Identification had been, sent out. But Heaton assured the public that the reports would pretty much state the same thing. He had been informed of their findings beforehand, and so he held the press conference. And instead of closing this case, the fact that they announced that they had closed it and that Scott was the shooter just caused more speculation and more questions throughout the whole area. Donna and Roger Smith felt indignant that the police had never interviewed them. In fact, they felt that the detectives ignored them entirely. So Donna and Roger Smith lived on the opposite side of the small county airport, which was directly across from Gary and Cheryl's home. Now, the Smiths reported that they had seen some strange activity early that Sunday morning. So their family was already dealing with a death, unfortunately. So there was extended family gathered at the Smith home. Roger's brothers and sister arrived sometime at his home around 6:30 a.m. It was pretty early. And so as the Smith siblings, stood out in their driveway comforting each other and stuff, they heard gunshots coming from the general direction of the airport and the Schaefer home. When they turned that direction, they heard even more gunshots. And it didn't really faze them. When you live out in this kind of rural area where hunting's a thing, right? Hearing early morning gunshots, especially early in the morning, you just kind of brush it off. And that's what they did. They're like, oh, hunters must have gotten an early start this morning. Now, once Donna and Roger Smith found out about the shootings, they called the sheriff's office immediately to inform them, what they had heard. But no one from the sheriff's office ever called them back, ever asked them anything. Local Rita Price and her husband also had some questions for the Logan County Sheriff's Office. So for the last 27 years, Rita owned and operated the local bakery/cafe in town. And around 10:30 a.m. that Sunday morning, a customer had come in and asked Rita, hey, do you know why the police have blocked off State Route 47? What the hell's going on? Now, Rita's husband had a police scanner at home, so she called up her husband at home, explained, and so her husband put the police scanner on and, put it up to the receiver, and Rita then held the phone out kind of like this, so her and a couple of the customers could hear what the police scanner was saying. And all of them said the same thing, that they heard the same thing, that a dispatcher said that officers were chasing a man across the road from the crime scene toward the county airport runway. And after the papers, reported the killings and that was going on, Rita said she combed every single article about the incident looking for any reference to what her and those customers heard about something to do with the airport and chasing someone. But she never saw a word about that. Now, finally, one of the customers who was there, listening with Rita and the others, wrote a letter to the Bell Fountain Examiner, the local paper, and questioned the whole investigation. That customer then, in the book, reportedly then received a phone call. It was specifically a message on her answering machine, and supposedly it said, quote, "You better keep your mouth shut." Yeah, so we're veering into, I guess, conspiracy theories, at least theories about what was going on. We're going to start veering into, some very questionable things. Don't you already have questions? Why weren't the Smiths asked after they, called the sheriff's office to report that? Honestly, I would like to know why Rita didn't call the police herself and ask about it. But, yeah, what about that? What they heard in the police scanner? What was going on at the airport? Was it not related at all? Was it the gray-haired man in the blue t-shirt? And then on June 26th, the full investigative report on the Moody Massacre was released. And basically in this report, it was trying to harp on, like, kind of the type of stuff that, like, Amanda was saying. It was like, oh, well, he had this explosive temper, and look, Kay went to this counseling center saying that he was abusive, and this, that, and the other. Basically, you know, the report was saying, like, yeah, Scott did this, look at all this, like, weird, shady shit, or whatever, like, yeah, it's done. Like, you know, let it rest. Now, as far as the will and the inheritance went, right, with everybody else dead, Stacy was now the beneficiary of 1/4 of her great-grandmother Wilma's will, or estate rather. Scott was the other beneficiary with 1/4 of his own, and with hundreds of thousands of dollars on the line and involved, 1/2 was going to go to 15-year-old Stacy, and the other was going to go to Scott's estate, which would end up being administered by his father Steve. And unsurprisingly, Scott's estate would also become the subject of 2 wrongful death lawsuits that were filed by the estates of Paige and Megan. Meanwhile, as all that untangled in the courts, Stacy continued to heal and try and cope. And as it is, right, some days were better than others. But slowly and steadily, with the help of her parents and friends and all that, she slowly healed and slowly, very slowly, began to come to terms with what had happened to her. I mean, and that's certainly a lot. This poor girl lost everything, man. At 15. On top of going through, like, the trauma of being shot. Like, it's just unreal. Stacy's first outing with friends was on July 2nd, and it was when she went to the Indian Lake fireworks show, and all of the emergency responders, hospital staff, and the doctors who had worked on Stacy threw, like, a little celebration for her on July 7th. And she even got to go on a helicopter ride, and she got to fly over the Mad River Mountain Ski Resort. Stacy would end up giving her first public interview on Sunday, July 10th, and she sat down with the Bell Fountain Examiner, and she was obviously, you know, interviewed at her home with her parents. And the family just spoke about, you know, the healing they were trying to do. They expressed their gratitude and appreciation of the donations they had received nationwide. Because remember, Steve and Audrey had 3 sons, they had jobs of their own, and so traveling back and forth to Columbus, hotel room visits, food, and all that, like, it added up. And when people, you know, heard about this case and whatnot, they had flooded the Moody's with a lot of donations. And so they were saying, like, this really helped us cover these costs while we were attending to Stacy in the hospital. Stacy spoke about the hundreds of, like, cards and letters of support that she had received from all across the nation. And she spoke about how they really did help her in her darkest moments. She said, quote, "The cards helped, and we still receive some every few days." And though she hadn't planned on it, Stacy did end up attending the familiar Logan County State Fair, and she ended up going with friends and family. Now, she didn't want to go at first because she was kind of nervous about making, like, such a public appearance at such a public place. Quote, "I don't want people just coming up to me and asking me questions and staring at me, but at the same time, I don't want people to be afraid to come up and talk to me." So, like, I can only imagine, right? She's still wearing, like, her halo at this point too, you know? So, like, I can only imagine, like, yeah, she's like, I don't want to be like the circus freak with people, like, gawking at me and stuff, but at the same time, like, I don't want people, like, not to talk to me, you know what I mean? Like, that's gotta be such, like, a weird tightrope to walk, you know? Like, just poor Stacy. And she's like a teenager on top of that, dude. Like, on top of that, like, going through, like, puberty and, like, the teenage years, you know? But Stacy's friends did talk her into going, but she had one condition. She would not show livestock. Instead, her younger half-brothers actually ended up exhibiting and showing some of her cattle on her behalf. So Steve, on behalf of Stacy, had entered 4 dairy heifers, 1 dairy beef feeder, and 2 market lambs in the junior fair competition. And when the organizers of the fair found out that, like, you know, Stacy wanted to attend and was kind of, like, nervous about being in such a public place, apparently they, like, did everything they could to, like, rein in the press. They wanted to make sure no one, like, gawked at her, especially when they were doing, like, their little, like, the fair showing off the livestock. And apparently they did a really good job of just making her feel comfortable and relaxed. And she ended up having a really good time. And as the summer of 2005 wore on, the media kept hounding Stacy for another interview. So finally, after a lot of consideration, Steve, Audrey, and Stacy decided to do one more interview. Stacy basically talked about, you know, her whole experience, how she believed that God had spared her for a purpose, and that she was determined to find out what that purpose was. She discussed her injuries and just how fragile, like, they really were, and how, like, messed up they made her. She talked about how she would have to be careful for the rest of her life. The bullet fragment that was still inside her was still inside her, and they decided to keep it inside of her because like the fragment was so close to some sort of like vertebrae in her neck. It was like so delicate that even any attempts to remove it could paralyze her. So they decided the best thing would be to just keep the bullet fragment inside Stacy, but she would still have to be careful. Quote, "If I get jerked the wrong way, I could become paralyzed." And that is where we will end part 2. And man, there's so much. Next week, we're going to talk more about Stacy. Unfortunately, Stacy is not done being traumatized in this case. We'll be talking a lot about sexual abuse next week, so be prepared for that. And yeah, what do you guys have to think so far? Don't you have so many questions so far? Like, what was up with these neighbors hearing the like police scanner about like an airport chase, and then like the Smiths hearing those gunshot sounds? Why didn't the Logan County Sheriff's Office go interview Dustin Splon? Like, he had been really good friends with Scott for years. If you so want to get like a good insight into who Scott was, why not interview Dustin, you know? And that's just, you know, some of the things that people question the Logan County Sheriff's Office for is like, were you just being lazy? Were you being incompetent? Were you trying to maybe cover up something? Yeah. Remember we talked once in this video about the fixer, which I don't think we'll really get into him till probably part 4, because there's not a lot known about him. We'll get all into it. It kind of veers into sort of like conspiratorial / like theory, you know, and it's just, there's so much to unravel. But yeah, this is what we have so far. So at this point, yeah, they decided to close the case. Scott's the shooter. We're all fine. We don't need to answer these other questions, despite all the stuff that a lot of these locals had questions about. And yeah, we will be back next week to continue going into this case. We will be spending a lot more time with Stacy and what happens to her. And then we will wrap up this case the week after with part 4. And like I said, even though this case is like officially closed, there are many questions that are still left to be answered and that we still don't have answers for. I don't know, man. Thank you so much to Smash the Bug for pointing me in the direction of this case, man. Like, this case is pretty wild and creepy, as, you know, we'll get into it. We'll get into it. Don't worry. Well, I guess that will do it for me this week. I want to go and play with my doggo now. I'm gonna go play with little Vex. There's another little picture of her because she's so cute. I love animals. They're seriously the best. I'm sorry. I love animals. I definitely love animals more than people sometimes. But yeah, until we meet again next week, take care of yourself out there. Be happy, healthy, and all that good stuff. Remember, don't be a dick. Don't be a douchewad. All right? Be better than that. You can. Leave a little sparkle wherever you go, okay? Like, that's what people need right now, all right? They need sparkles in their life, all right? They don't need shit. They got enough of that. So just do your best to spread all of your glorious sparkle everywhere when you go out, okay? Alrighty, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out. Sorry again that part 1 was a week delayed. Come on, how am I supposed to get any work done with this precious face, you know? How? Tell me how. Alrighty, guys. I'll see you next week for part 3 of the Scott Moody case. Bye-bye.